So welcome back, everybody. I'd like to begin our second panel, which will feature presentations by Geoff, Dancy, and Timo Thoms, focusing on the impact of transitional justice policies on human rights practices and the prevention of conflict. So after the presentation, we'll hear responses from Amy Smith, who is the Ceasefires and Implementation of Peace Processes team leader at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And then also Juan Albarracín, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We'll then open the floor to Q&A. So if you have a question, the way it's going to work is you'll raise your hand, and then my colleague will move you from being an attendee to a presenter. And then I'll call on you, and you'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask your question. And I'll ask that you try to keep your questions brief so that we have as much time for conversation as possible. All right, so without any more delay, I'll turn it over to Geoff and Timo.
Thank you, Avery. Geoff is going to share the slides for us, and I'm going to get us started. So Geoff and I will present the second takeaway, that despite the fact that transitional justice sometimes is a lightning rod for criticisms, TJ mechanisms do work. And by that, we mean that they are associated with beneficial outcomes. However, these outcomes do vary by context. We also take this opportunity to briefly introduce the TJ database and website. So we recently launched transitionaljusticedata.org, which presents all of our data and research outputs, as well as additional information on individual countries. In a moment, we'll point out a couple of key features of this website, but here I want to note that we consider this website a living repository of TJ information, in that we continue to update the data and are adding new content as it becomes available. So the TJ database contains information on 5 mechanisms: amnesties, reparations policies, prosecutions for human rights and conflict crimes, truth commissions, and vetting policies. With the exception of vetting, our data are truly global, covering over 190 countries from 1970 to 2020. For vetting, we have focused on our data collection on Eastern Europe and post-Soviet countries. So here we show you the global trends, and I'll briefly note just a couple of observations. First, the use of amnesties was increasing until the early 1990s, but has since then declined. Second, and this will be the topic of the next panel discussion on the justice cascade, criminal prosecutions have increased steadily until about 2010, and then sharply declined in the last decade of our data. And third, reparations policies and truth commissions have not seen such a decline, and there appears to be a recent resurgence in new truth commissions. So all of our data are available on the website on the downloads page, where we also provide supporting documentation and list any changes that we make to the database going forward. And there's also a very detailed FAQ page explaining the database and the website. While our database is global and inclusive, because TJ mechanisms have been employed in a wide variety of contexts, as you probably know, we are keenly aware that the TJ literature is rooted in questions about transitional countries, be that transitions from autocracy to democracy or from conflict to peace. In order to enable empirical research on justice for human rights violations in different contexts, our database lets researchers tailor their samples. Among 198 countries in total, we coded 58 countries as non-transitional, i.e. those that were stable autocracies or democracies, 104 countries that had one or more democratic transitions, 98 countries that had any intrastate conflict according to UCDP, and 62 countries which had both democratic transition and conflict. The underlying database is relational and flexible, and the TJET website makes it very easy to navigate to country cases that are relevant to users' interests. On the landing page, users can filter the data for particular mechanisms, contexts, regions, and time periods. So for instance, here on the next slide is the regional breakdown of the mechanisms from before. A couple of patterns jump out. First, amnesties were more commonly used in Africa and Asia than elsewhere. Second, and this will likely not surprise TJ scholars, the Americas had by far the most human rights prosecutions, and within the region, Chile and Argentina are the leaders. Perhaps more surprising, Africa and Asia had the second and third most criminal prosecutions ahead of Europe. And third, reparations policies and truth commissions are more evenly spread across the regions. So now I turn it over to Geoff to discuss some findings and next steps in our work. You're muted, Geoff.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. I caught it. Thanks, Timo. Timo and I have been conducting a series of analyses on the impact of transitional justice using these data, and we look in different contexts. We'll only show you kind of the tip of the iceberg, a couple of findings, and we're happy to open it up a bit more and talk in more detail in Q&A. But the first context that we're going to highlight are transitional democracies. By transitional democracies, for the purposes of the data we're going to show you, mean all the states that follow a change from autocratic to democratic rule or which experience intrastate conflict. So we're sampling all democracies that live inside the two circles of the Venn diagram. So all democracies in this space here. Our question is, does transitional justice improve human rights in practice, which is something that we have studied in prior iterations. We had, Catherine and I worked on a project called Transitional Justice Research Collaborative, and we published a study in 2019 that used data up through 2010. So this is in some ways an update of those analyses, and we're wondering if using the updated data, we see the similar trends and patterns. So what you're looking at here is a coefficients plot, a figure that represents the statistical relationship between transitional justice mechanisms and respect for human rights. If the dot on one of the rows is to the right of the vertical line, it means the transitional justice mechanism on that row is associated with the declining use of repression or greater respect for human rights. If the dot's to the left of the vertical line, it means the corresponding mechanism is associated with more repressive violence by state governments or less respect for human rights. If the straight lines around the dot crosses the vertical line, it means that there's no statistically observable effect. What the figure shows is the answer to our question is yes, with the exception of vetting or lustration policies, transitional justice mechanisms are associated with greater respect for human rights or fewer physical integrity violations. And to measure the violations, we use data collected by Chris Ferris, which combines various indices of physical integrity violations. We also can show that amnesties are associated in general, on average, with less respect for physical integrity. And this is an interesting, this is very interesting that there's this distinction. We see that all of the transitional justice policies are associated with slight increases in respect for human rights, save for amnesty, which is something that we might expect coming out of the literature. We also study post-conflict states. So when we talk about post-conflict states, we mean everything in the yellow highlighted region, all country cases in this space. So you can break intrastate conflicts into, or intrastate conflict countries into those that where conflict is ongoing or those that where conflict has terminated. And we are specifically, for the purposes of the analysis I'm about to show you, looking at the post-conflict cases, so all the countries in the yellow space. To study the question of how transitional justice affects the sustainability of peace in post-conflict situations, we use survival models, which were devised, of course, to study the effect of medical treatments on cancer patients. What you're looking at is a survival graph, and it plots information on all post-conflict states since 1970. On the x-axis are years after conflict, and on the y-axis is the probability of the peace continuing to last. If and when conflict resumes in a case, it's considered a failure of peace, and you see that over time, failure happens in more and more cases. To make interpretation easier, consider the point in red. What this says is that, on average, post-conflict states are 60% likely to last to 10 years of peace. So for our purposes, the question is, how does transitional justice alter this survival rate? To begin, we look at the effect of prosecutions. So here's the same plot with an orange line representing cases that have had post-conflict prosecutions. We could say at 10 years, post-conflict states with prosecutions are about 80% likely to last versus 60% of cases that don't have prosecutions. So on this basis, we could say that trials are associated with a roughly 25% increase in the sustainability of post-conflict peace. What about other transitional justice mechanisms? This is the same plot, but zeroing in on the effect of reparations. We could say that reparations are associated with a higher survival rate represented by the green line signifying the presence of a reparations policy. And that line is slightly above the blue baseline rate, which means it increases the chance that peace survives. So in the end, we could say reparations are associated with a slight increase in peace sustainability, though the relationship is somewhat weak. Finally, and perhaps surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, truth commissions are associated with a decline in the survival rate. You can see that the truth commission line in black falls under the line representing all post-conflict states without truth commissions. So on the basis of this, we say that truth commissions are associated with a slight decrease in peace sustainability, but this is also a statistically weak relationship. But the bottom line is we're not seeing a hugely positive effect of truth commissions, and that could be because we know that there's a wide variety of truth commission practices. Some are set up to be what might be referred to as smoke screens, where it appears that there's compliance with human rights norms, though the truth commissions are established to fail in some ways. This doesn't exhaust our findings about post-conflict. We've also done work on amnesties, and we could say that amnesties for rebels can contribute to peace, especially if these amnesties are part of a peace deal. However, we don't see an effect of amnesties for extreme human rights violations. If serious international crimes are amnestied, this does not seem to promote peace. I just want to gesture towards our next steps by saying that we are working on developing transitional justice indices that take information on all of the various mechanisms and group them into larger subcomponents of transitional justice measures that say to what extent has the country provided some criminal justice for harms that have been committed, to what extent has it promoted actual truth telling, and to what extent has it promoted reparations. We intend on having these components combined in the end into a larger transitional justice index. On the basis of preliminary work that we've done, we can say that these are the cases that have the greatest gap between legacies of violence and the provision of justice, meaning that there's been very low provision of transitional justice, though a great deal of violence. And this bears out. I think these cases will resonate with everyone, South Sudan being the highest, and North Korea, but also on the list, Myanmar, Venezuela, and Nigeria. So our next steps are to refine this index to make for an easier cross-national comparison based on the various components of our data set. We have hundreds of variables that measure all facets of transitional justice mechanisms, and we're trying to make it easier to consume all of those pieces of information and use them for analysis. We're also working to update our trial data and validate it based on in-country data that we receive. We've already done this for Argentina and Chile. We've done it for Guatemala. We're working to refine our data for Bosnia and some other cases as well. And this speaks to the next point, which is that we would like to move towards expert crowdsourcing of many of these data. We know that any database that's global will make errors, and we intend on using the body of knowledge that exists within the expert community to correct our errors. So we very much want our website to be interactive and to take into account the lived experience on the ground. The final thing is that Timo and I have a paper under review right now that asks the question, has transitional justice failed to prevent democratic decline? This speaks to a question that Anna Cave had in the last panel about whether there's institutions being developed and transitional justice contributes to that. What we could say is that transitional justice appears to help prevent democratic decline to autocratic rule, but it does not help prevent democratic backsliding, which means the illiberalization of democracy. I'll leave you with that provocative point and we hope to have questions about that we can address in the Q&A period. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Geoff and Timo, for a fascinating presentation. We'll now hear from Amy Smith, who is the Ceasefires and Implementation of Peace Processes team leader at the Office for Conflict, Stabilisation, and Mediation at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. Amy is a career diplomat who has held several overseas positions, including Deputy Head Commissioner to Malta. Amy, please take 5 minutes to respond to the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. I mean, I've been fortunate to work with the team over the last year, and your work's been incredibly useful. Having evidence to back up our policy making is so useful to us. So a massive thank you already. I just, bearing in mind I have 5 minutes, I just wanted to talk about some of the points that's coming out in some of the research and how it helps us as policymakers. So, as I mentioned, having evidence-based policy is kind of the holy grail for us. And when you look at some of our assumptions, so for example, around criminal accountability and the impact that has potentially on conflict prevention and on human rights protections, having the evidence to back that up of what essentially was an assumption by us is useful, because that means that then we can continue to fund that, continue to put resources into it. It was never the case that we wouldn't do that, but it just means that when we get asked, we can say, yes, here's the evidence. When we look at the some of the other items that came out, so around reparation policy, that's an area that we have less focus on as policymakers, but actually seeing that statistical analysis saying it does have an impact on conflict non-recurrence, it means as a policymaker, you can look at this and think, maybe we should look at it a bit more closely, and we'll have some big reparations policies coming up. So, you know, what we do in Ukraine, for example, the impact that can have is going to be really important to us. Your research also helps us when we're looking at, for example, looking at the false narrative between peace and justice. So, you know, it's great that you're looking at a holistic approach that's survivor-led, but what does that really mean? And the fact that survivors want peace and justice, and we have the evidence around, amnesties not demonstrating a link to causing peace. That's really helpful for us because, as the UK, we have a big focus on survivor-led policy. We have the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict initiative, which has been going for many years. We have our own conflict and atrocity prevention department. So being able to draw on your survivor-led evidence and be able to say, we don't support blanket amnesties as the UK, but here's the evidence of why, when people are coming to us saying, oh, but what about peace negotiations, that's not something we'll be kind of knocked off course over. And then just to talk about the kind of how it's useful to us in terms of the big picture. So the last 10 years, we're seeing more conflict. It's more complex. We're seeing an end to comprehensive peace agreements. There's definitely a transition away from those. So how do we then look at how you get transitional justice, big policies into that? And learning from what's gone before and learning from different international contexts and how the interplay is, that's really useful, because actually that means that we've got all this background. And as we have a changing world at the moment, and not all of that can be attributed to transitional justice. There's a lot of politics happening at the moment, but how do we draw on that research? And then just to echo some of the comments that others have already made, so the ambassador in particular around resourcing. So where do we put our resourcing? What has the biggest impact for us? We live in a world of finite resourcing. So how do we make sure that goes a long way? I mean, justice processes take a really long time. They're really political. They're very difficult to implement. So what ones are going to have the greatest impact, and how do we keep that political attention? I think for us, again, drawing on this research, that's helpful as a policymaker to say to ministers, we need to go in for 10 years, 20, whatever, and the impact that will have. And then just finally, conscious of time, great to hear on next steps on the research. Again, kind of bringing the components of transitional justice together. So, the criminal accountability together with truth-telling, and how the combination has an impact would be really interesting. And then just on the kind of temporal limit. So does it matter if it's after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? We've seen ourselves in Northern Ireland. that, communities want to see justice however long it takes, and that's something that we shouldn't take our eyes off the ball on. And I will leave it there because I've had the 1 minute warning and I do want to leave space for comments. But again, a massive well done to the whole team. We use this evidence all the time. We share it with our embassies and our geographic desks. So thank you again.
Thank you, Amy, for your thoughtful response and for keeping it under 5 minutes, which is impressive. So I'll now turn to Juan Albarracín, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Juan's work focuses on political transitions and democracy in Latin America. Juan, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to put the timer here because this is such exciting research. I might just keep talking. I first want to thank you for this invitation. I've been using, and my colleagues who, Ciatisco and Guillermo, who have worked with me on other projects, we've been using data by this team and by the previous collaborators. So I just want to be so thankful for the tremendous public good that you've provided. Clearly to the policy community, but also to the academic community. I don't think a lot of the research that's coming out right now on transitional justice and its effects could do anything without your group. So thank you so much. And I think what you've been doing by providing this public research is helping us do something that has been at the core of kind of the transitional justice research agenda from the beginning, this debate between the potential negative effects of transitional justice and destabilizing conflict-prone countries, but also countries that were undergoing very delicate transitional processes, against this idea of, no, we need accountability in order to have better democracies and better post-conflict societies. So I think the debates were important at the theoretical level, but I think the ability to have high-quality data to be able to discern actually the impact of transitional justice processes is absolutely essential. And I think in the last couple of years, again, thanks to a lot of the people who are here, this has undergone a tremendous advance. And some of the results you presented today are testament to that. I'm going to focus mostly on a couple of key issues that keep popping up, and not to me and my collaborators, when we think about the effects of transitional justice and that are in line with what you presented today. One is this idea of the interactions of mechanisms. I think you showed today kind of the impact of specific transitional justice mechanisms and on the reduction of conflict probability and increasing the respect of human rights. But as we've seen, that some of these things kind of come together in interesting combinations, and sometimes these combinations are kind of increase the impact of some of the mechanisms that you wouldn't see individually. So I think as we move forward as an academic community, looking at these ecosystems of transitional justice mechanisms is absolutely key, because it could go in a positive direction, but also in a negative direction as well. So looking at these combinations seems important. At the same time, and to my second point, this idea of the quality of the process and the robustness of it, which is extremely hard to measure. And there's various attempts, and I think you're already looking at, well, are we charging high-ranking officials, or how does these things look? And it is extremely hard. And I say that also as someone who's in a group who's been trying to measure this. But this can matter a lot, right? Because maybe it's the kind of when we don't have robust processes, and when these processes are implemented and in a low quality way, the impact could be even more negative than not having them. So I think measuring these things and having ways of looking at the quality of the process, which is extremely hard, can be important to assess the actual impact. And not only in one moment in time, but some of these things go over time. So when we think about this in kind of medical terms, this can look like multiple boosters of the same vaccine. And this also goes to the question, my third point, of timing. And as I was thinking at the paper Geoff and Oskar presented, I read today on this type of research, when we apply some of these mechanisms can matter in the impact it has in society, for example, in polarization. And I'm reminded of the example of Brazil that had this amazing Truth Commission after 2010, and it was incredible in its findings and in its quality. But in that moment in time, it was also used by right-wing political groups to advance their political agenda. So sometimes when these things happen also matters. And finally, when we think about assessing the effect that these mechanisms have, it's also interesting and important to know in what context they're occurring. And for the most part, they're occurring in countries that are riddled with all kinds of problems. And maybe sometimes when we're measuring the effect of transitional justice, it's being diluted because all of these other things are happening that are diluting the effect. And in the absence of transitional justice, this would look much worse. But measuring that much worse is extremely hard. So when I think about one of the results, again, and I'm about to close here, that Geoff and Oskar were looking at the effect of transitional justice on political association, it might well be that in places where this transitional justice threatens governments and elites, they try to clamp down on political association. But at the same time, transitional justice also strengthens associations and civic society associations and gives them the power to resist some of these worst encroachments on political power. So it can do many things at the same time. So assessing those impacts is extremely hard, but also necessary. And I'm thinking right now, the case of Guatemala, where, of course, transitional justice had this backlash by the elites, but at the same time, it strengthened civil society in such a way that it now made them, gave them the political acumen to become a political party that now runs the country. So all of these things happen at the same time. So disentangling these effects is actually quite key as the agenda moves forward. But once again, thank you so much for all the amazing work you all do, and really excited about what was presented today and all the work that comes ahead.
Thank you so much, Juan. I think it's really great to have feedback from both practitioner and academic. It gives a really well-rounded perspective on the presentation. So now I'm going to turn to Q&A. And again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then my colleague will promote you to be a panelist, and then I'll call on you, and you'll be able to unmute yourself. And for first question, to get us underway, we're going to turn to Chris Shea. So Chris, I'll ask you to just introduce yourself briefly in 1 to 2 sentences, and then ask your question, and then we'll get the conversation going. Thank you.
Thanks, Avery. I'm Christopher Shea. I'm a postdoc at the Harvard School of Public Health, where I work really closely with Fong and Patrick. Geoff, thanks so much, and Timo, for your really lucid presentation. I think the comments have been great. On top of that, I might add a question about basically selection effects. So I'm really curious about why you think maybe some countries were able to implement some mechanisms, but not others. And there might be policy implications from that. Maybe the low-hanging fruit is already gone, and maybe new policies or new strategies will be necessary to implement mechanisms going forward. So thanks. Looking forward to your responses.
Moderator, shall we go ahead and
Yeah, take it away.
issues? Okay, great. Thank you so much for the very nuanced responses, Amy and Juan. I just want to say on some of the details that you're asking about, Juan, that that these are very critical points. And overall, the mission of our project is to create some kind of data flexibility that allows you to pinpoint and address each of these kinds of problems that as you become intellectually interested in them. So if you want to study sequencing, we hope that we provide the tools to study sequencing. We have timelines that allow you to see when the mechanisms have been initiated and how they've been kind of addressed over time. And then you might work that into a case study of the implementation of transitional justice, but you also might try to build measures that basically interact with the mechanisms with time. So far, I'll say that we haven't found much about sequencing. And when we've studied this question, we don't see patterns. This is something that is very responsive to context. And so there aren't, the law of averages might not work here. But maybe it does, and maybe we're looking in the wrong place, and we're open to that as well. On a general comment about the quality of the processes, one thing that we've attempted to do is by collecting so much information on each truth commission or reparations policy, and as much as we can on each prosecution, we try to allow for the possibility that there are effectively good and bad mechanisms, and that we have measures on hand to indicate the quality that will go into that's part of what will inform these larger component indices. So if we know that the Truth Commission, for example, has maybe published a report, but it's not been made publicly available, and it doesn't really have recommendations that are meant to affect change, then that should be reflected in our data, and that's something that's very important to us. I'm happy that you mentioned the case of Guatemala, because I've been thinking a lot about Guatemala lately. I have a piece with Rachel Lopez on Guatemala and what it might say for the United States and the Trump prosecutions. But Guatemala does fit this pattern that Timo and I have discovered in the data writ large, which is that there is an association between transitional justice and political engagement. And that's something that's been found in the micro level by people like Elise Voitas and Alea Balcells, who might be on the call here. There is this relationship. There's a greater engagement that follows transitional justice, but there's also greater polarization. And those things kind of go together. And we should expect that. And what does that mean for democracy? And so that's part of what's animating our interest in those questions. Timo, do you want to talk about selection, or do you want me to?
No, you go ahead, but I would like to add something on the quality of TJ.
Okay, go ahead and add it now.
Yeah, okay. So I completely agree with you, Juan, and also with Pablo, that this issue of the quality of TJ mechanisms is obviously very important, and people have talked about that for a long time in the transitional justice literature. And as Geoff said, we've made a lot of effort to collect a lot of different pieces of information about different transitional justice mechanisms. But it's much harder to do that on prosecutions than on the other mechanisms. I mean, we as Geoff said, we have made an effort, and we have data on convictions and whether there were appeals processes and what's the final outcome versus the initial outcome. But at the same time, when you think about the quality of prosecutions, you might think about rule of law aspects, like what's the actual fairness of the process, and that is extremely difficult. And I'm not sure how we could collect that data for all the trials that we have in the database. So in that sense, the data on criminal prosecutions is a little bit more limited on the quality, but we have made an effort, and we hope that researchers will use the data in all kinds of different ways that we can't even think of.
I just want to quickly address the selection issue, and then we'll turn it over to more questions. But thank you, Chris, for asking that question. It's an important one. There are selection effects. And what that means for the non-social scientists on the call is there are some places that are both more likely to have transitional justice and to have other kinds of beneficial outcomes because they're predisposed to good outcomes, whereas there are other cases that are likely to have transitional justice policies that are more problematic and are likely to have bad outcomes. We know that there are these effects. The question is it possible to implement transitional justice in a way that moves a country from the predisposition to bad outcomes to the predisposition to good outcomes? And we think that does happen in certain cases. And so if we follow some cases along, like Guatemala, for example, I think some people might have argued that it's part of the predisposed to bad outcomes cases. It might be moving in a direction towards endogenous institutional change in a positive direction. And we might be witnessing that in real time as, there's a surprise election of Arevalo, who's an anti-corruption reformer in the country, though a lot of the political forces were against that outcome. So these are the kinds of things that we attempt to track, and it does appear, and I can only say this without being able to show it to you, that transitional justice is associated with endogenous and institutional change in some instances, meaning that it strengthens the courts and judicial constraints on the executive, and it does increase the willingness of the public to engage in political association. And these things are slow moving and gradual, but we can observe the relationship between transitional justice and those changes. So despite the existence of selection, there are also indications that transitional justice contributes to change.